Hello, and welcome to today's ACM Learning Webinar. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning. This webinar is brought to you by the Special Interest Group for Artificial Intelligence, SIG-AI, and specifically the SIG-AI Industry Committee. We have a monthly webinar on different topics on various AI issues. I'm Rose Paradis, Secretary-Treasurer for SIG-AI, and member of the SIG-AI Industry Liaison Committee. I'm a Principal Machine Learning Research Scientist for Leidos, Data Analytics Products and Services, where I build machine learning models and do data analytics for a number of big data applications. And my work focuses on data and text analytics, computational linguistics, and natural language processing. Plamen Petrov, another moderator on the call today, is the Industry Liaison Officer for SIG-AI, and he's the Director of the Cognitive Technology Group at KPMG LLP, where he applies advanced AI and data science techniques to drive business transformation within the KPMG and at KPMG clients. He's also the Lab Director for the dedicated Intelligent Automation Lab within KPMG, Ignition. And he works with a team of highly skilled resources that utilize leading tools and approaches to build AI solutions. His work focuses on areas such as natural language processing, probabilistic knowledge representation and reasoning, machine learning, and other algorithms. He's also serves on the faculty of the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he teaches graduate courses in AI, natural language processing, and cognitive analytics. Today's presentation is Automation versus Augmentation, Socially Assistive Robotics and the Future of Work by Dr. Maja Matarić. You can find more info on our backgrounds in the bio widget on your screen. And let me just take a few minutes to go over some ACM and SIG-AI information. Okay, so for those of you who may be unfamiliar with ACM or SIG-AI or what it has to offer, here's some more information. ACM offers a lot of educational and professional development resources that can enhance your skills and career opportunities. There's such thing as conferences, webinars, publications. You can visit the Learning Center resources at learning.acm.org. And our group, the Special Interest Group on AI, is made up of academic, industrial researchers, practitioners, and software developers, and users and students. And so I'm not going to read to you the whole list, but our goal is basically to promote and support the growth and application of AI principles and techniques through computing. We sponsor and co-sponsor AI-related conferences. The two that we generally are aware or sponsor are the Career Networking Conference for early stage researchers in AI, and then the AI and AAAI and ACM Conference on Artificial Intelligence, Ethics, and Society. We also sponsor awards and support journals and provide scholarships. You can see the whole list there, and you're welcome to go to the SIG-AI link and find out other things, and we're always welcoming new members to join our list or to join our mailing list. One other thing we wanted to go over, which you saw in the beginning, was the housekeeping. First, the slides are going to advance automatically through the event. Dr. Matarić will be pressing those and showing some videos as we do that. On the bottom panel, you'll find a number of additional widgets and resources. If you're experiencing problems with the slides or audio, please press your F5 key in Windows, Command +R if you're on a Mac, or refresh your browser. If you need to, just close and relaunch the presentation. To control the volume, just adjust the master volume on your computer. And if you have questions during this webinar for something that's wrong, or if you have questions for Dr. Matarić, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom during the webinar and click the Submit button. Plamen and I will actually organize the questions as Maya speaks, and we'll actually be able to ask Maya these questions at the end of the webinar. This session, however, usually we record this. This is not being recorded, but you can check the learning.acm.org for any upcoming webcasts. And there's also a short survey at the end of the webinar, which I would ask you to please take. It's only 5 questions. And so let me introduce our speaker for today without further ado. Dr. Maja Matarić is professor and Chansun Xiang Chair in the Computer Science Department, Neuroscience Program in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Southern California, and is the founding director of the USC Robotics and Autonomous Systems Center and vice dean for research in the USC Viterbi School of Engineering. She received her PhD in computer science and AI from MIT, MS in computer science from MIT, and BS in computer science from the University of Kansas. She's a fellow of a number of groups, AAAS, IEEE, and AAAI, and a recipient of the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring, the Anita Borg Institute of Women of Vision Award for Innovation, the Akawa Foundation Award, and a number of other awards here, which you could read in her bio. She was featured in the science documentary movie, Me and Isaac Newton, in the New Yorker Robotics at Care article by Jerome Grootman, and many other publications, including as one of the LA Times Magazine 2010 visionaries. Professor Matarić is the author of a popular introductory robotics textbook, The Robotics Primer, from MIT Press, an associate editor of 3 major journals, and has published extensively. She's also served on a number of advisory boards, including the NSF Computing and Information Sciences and Engineering Division Advisory Committee. Dr. Matarić's research is developing robotic-assisted therapies for children with autism spectrum disorders, stroke, and traumatic brain injury survivors, and individuals with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. She's also the co-founder and chief science officer of Embodied Incorporated. So Maja, we're ready for you to begin your presentation, so take it away.
Thank you. It's great to have this opportunity. This is my first webinar, hopefully not the last, so I'm just going to do my best. So I am going to talk about a much bigger picture than robotics, but I'm going to ground it in robotics because, after all, that is my field. So I've been in robotics for a very long time, and I'm happy to say that robotics has finally arrived. And in many ways, that is so because of the developments in all of the adjacent fields, including perception and AI and machine learning. So how do we judge that robotics has finally arrived? Well, there was a presidential initiative, and thus the picture of President Obama. But really, the way we can tell it's arrived is by the extremely large investment that is being made across many of the leading industries. And that is, of course, a feeder into more education, more training, and more development and more commercialization. So with that backdrop, if we step back a little bit and say, well, so the initial definition of robotics, the initial conception of it more than 50 years ago, was that robots were machines that do work. And in fact, the kind of work that robots are supposed to do is supposed to be menial labor. So the word robota for robot actually comes from the Czech, meaning menial labor. And so it's interesting if we think about the original idea of robotics was basically supposed to be the 3 R's of robotics, that the robots are supposed to be doing the 3 D's of robotics, sorry. So the 3 D's, which are dirty, dull, and dangerous. So menial labor being things that are dirty, dull, and dangerous for humans to do. But here we are today, the field is exploding, and most of what is being done is not really under those categories. Some of it is, as you can see in some of the imagery here, indeed, there's been a lot of work in assembly from the nanoscales all the way up to the macro scales of auto assembly, from DNA sequencing and up. But a lot of what is going on today is going into the service industry for things that we never even imagined we would need robots to do, but suddenly the robots are being developed to do it. And so this creates this interesting idea of possible futures, which is that if robots are doing work, then what are people doing? And that's a topic of a lot of debate today. And it's going to be a topic of even more debate, naturally, as further technology and automation develops, and it's developing very rapidly. And so there are multiple possible futures that come out of automation, and some are more positive than others. And of course, we don't know which one we're going to create because it is ultimately up to all of us, both in technology and in policy, to think about where this is going. So there's a very interesting debate happening that is going to grow. And the point that I would like to make is that the vast majority of research happening today in robotics is on the side of what we might call as automation or replacement of human work. So it is indeed the case that if we focus on the dirty, dull, and dangerous, those are the kinds of work that we would want to automate or replace. But there is a very large spectrum of the kinds of things machines can and should be doing. And on the augmentation side of things, enhancement of human ability, there is tremendous potential. That potential, however, is currently unexplored. It's unexplored in terms of number of people working on it. It's unexplored specifically because of the size of investment going into it, in particular in industry, but also in research. So that's sort of going to be the key point from which I want to start this talk, which is that as we think about machines doing work, what is the kind of work that we want machines to do, whether they're physically embodied or not? And can we imagine a future in which machines, and robots in particular, are helping and being very helpful to us without actually taking over all of our physical work? And one context in which that can be seen as particularly helpful is care. So we're all aware of the aging population. People are sometimes less aware, but are starting to be aware also of the fact that we have very large challenges entirely through the spectrum, the age spectrum. So there is a very large instance of developmental disabilities. Autism, for example, is affecting now 1 in 45 children. It's quadrupled in the last 20 years. So that's just one example of challenges that are happening on the younger age spectrum. 1 in 6 children experiences a developmental disability. And then things like anxiety and depression are on the rise across the age spectrum. And then, of course, on the aging side of things, we are aware of the rapidly accelerating pace of Alzheimer's, dementia, and other age-related challenges. And so there's a huge challenge as well as a huge opportunity in the care gap. And there are many different technologies that are being explored. So the one that I would like to focus our attention on is really how robotics can make a difference and how AI and machine learning can make a difference, but couched in what people really need, as opposed to what technologists might want to develop. Surprisingly or not, still today, there's a big gap between what people need and want and what is being developed. So technologies that actually do provable differences in human health outcomes based on research are those that improve our motivation to do our own work rather than take work away from us. So again, this is back to this point of who should actually be doing work and who has the associated sort of meaning and purpose of doing work. We find in research as a field, and I don't mean my work, but broadly, that technologies that encourage people to feel a purpose and do their own work tend to extend lifespan and improve health outcomes. It is well known that also technologies that encourage socialization with other people in the real world have better health outcomes than technologies that encourage socialization in the cyber world. Certainly there's a lot of debate right now about Facebook. I don't need to amplify that other than to say that there is science out there pointing to some concerns. And then finally, we do need technologies that adapt to provide personalized encouragement, motivation, challenges, and care, rather than sort of one-size-fits-all that might be appealing in terms of scalability from a kind of commercial perspective, but isn't necessarily the best thing. Fortunately, machine learning can make a difference here. So the main issue with what people want is that drive and effort to be alive and to do things and to thrive cannot really be outsourced to technology. So for a human to do well and thrive, one has to want to be, exist, and do things. And so it is not a matter of technology doing all of our work and taking our purpose away. It is a matter of finding technologies that can augment and enhance our ability to have a purpose and do our work. And so for that, in that context, I want to talk about socially assistive robotics, which is an interesting field at an intersection of multiple technological developments. So it is at sort of at the intersection of AI, machine learning, robotics, and assistive systems. And the goal of socially assistive robotics is to help people through social, not physical interaction. So that's an interesting concept to people. The field itself has been around. It was named a little less than 15 years ago. Actually, it was by a graduate student from my lab, so I'm extremely proud of him now. And of course, I've always been proud of him. And so the field has been around for a while, and it's growing, and in many ways it's growing because of the need in the real world. Sometimes academia can take a bit longer to recognize, but the real world marches at its own pace. So the point of these assistive technologies, in particular socially assistive robotics, is not so much to do monitoring. Monitoring we can do. But the thing about monitoring human behavior is that all the data today show that the quantified self, the idea that you as an individual can get a bunch of data about yourself, whether it's your step count, heart rate, etc., that is not, unfortunately, going to be very effective at changing your behavior. So behavior change, making yourself do what you should be doing, but you are not doing because it is difficult, challenging, demoralizing, depressing, etc., that does not change just because you know you should do it. So that, this is well known from areas in rehab all the way to weight loss, smoking cessation, etc. So what people need, what truly changes human behavior, according to neuroscience as well as developmental science and social science, cognitive science literature, is a combination of having intrinsic motivation. You have to want to do something. And then also external support that comes from social support, companionship, and socialization. So the idea of socially assistive robotics is to get at the intersection of those, to provide machines that will be there to help your motivation, help you adhere to therapist medication, healthy lifestyle, whatever it may be, but also coach and train, and then provide that fundamental social component. Without the social component, in isolation, very few people can actually go through truly challenging behavior change. So that is a vision of really personalized care in a sense that it's really personalized to what each individual person needs by bringing to bear all the technologies that will actually be necessary, so machine learning, AI, et cetera. But ultimately, toward the goal of not automating work, but rather enabling the person to do their own work. So you might ask, well, that sounds great, but why do we need robots for this? So embodiment is fundamental. There's also a science of embodiment that's been growing rapidly in the last 15 to 20 years. And there's quite a bit of data to show that the way we are wired makes it so that we process information with physical social peers, so other humans, pets, and also robots, differently than we do interactions with screens. So certainly when you're interacting with screens and when you're motivated, such as whatever it may be, a game or whatever, there is more and different activation going on when we're interacting with physically embodied social peers, both in terms of location of activation and the magnitude of activation. And those are results from imaging experiments done by neuroscientists. That's not our work. We're just, as a field, informed by the fact that this is how we're wired. This is why, for example, children learn better with physical teachers in the room and tactile learning by physically manipulating objects. So this has been well known in early learning, but now is also becoming established in rehabilitation and other behavior change. And it's interestingly timed because at the same time, people are trying to take learning away from the classroom and put it in a disembodied context where we might have some unanticipated consequences. So since embodiment is fundamental, we've spent the last 15 years looking at different complex domains in which embodiment would play a role. So we've looked at cardiac disease rehab, we've looked at autism, special education, as well as on the aging side of the spectrum, Alzheimer's care, and then retirement and nursing homes. And we are focused on these domains for two reasons. One, because those are really the fundamental challenges in terms of numbers, the instance, from 1 in 2 to 1 in 7 to 1 in 10, all the way to the fact that these are where wonderful collaborations could be done with our interdisciplinary researchers, because the last thing we want to do is be dilettantes in these complex fields. And so let me talk to you about some interesting domains and what it actually takes to make this happen. And to start that, let me begin with a video that illustrates sort of almost the state of the art. Here's a stroke patient having to do activities of daily life. It's depressing and demoralizing to do stroke rehab because you drop things, you're clumsy, you look stupid. Good morning, Connie. So you need a social companion there to help you all the time. But who will be there all the time? It would be great if somebody were there all the time.
Hey, Connie, have you thought about your exercises? I bet you're feeling strong today.
Well, she might not be feeling strong, but she's eating fiber, so that's good. We call the water a trap for the robot. If it doesn't fall in, it's a robot. The robot.
Hey, Connie, are you ready? I brought my workout clothes.
So the robot has to trigger her motivation to do something she doesn't really feel like doing. And then it has to be there to kind of establish that social contract to keep her going. Because it cares. It's there as a social companion and an anchor. It's like a promise to a friend that you're going to do something.
Seriously, you can do better than that.
And so for each patient, different motivation works. For some, telling jokes and pushing them verbally works. For others, it's more soothing, depending on their personality.
I want to be a robot, but I am not blind.
Humor can be very effective, but only when it's used appropriately, and certainly can never be repetitive. Someone there to celebrate every little victory is fundamental for going on. All right, so this is important. Why would she eat an activity of daily life with her stroke-affected limb, which is much more complex, much more challenging, messy, etc.? Here's why. Because she can basically say, hey, I did it. And there's someone there to see that she did. That is the social contract, and that is the power of embodiment, because there are not a lot of apps that can do this kind of thing. In fact, none that I've seen. So let me talk a little bit about the domains, and then we're going to talk about what does it take. So stroke is an obvious one. We've worked in stroke rehabilitation for 15 years. One of the key things that we learned early is that what is really hard about stroke rehab is motivating people to keep doing the exercises, not telling them how to do the exercise. So it's not really about correcting people endlessly and nagging them, but rather making them want to do what they need to do, which is very hard because, again, it's demoralizing to do it. It's demoralizing to do activities of daily life with a limb that keeps you looking disabled, that you keep dropping things. You're not very effective. It's a lot easier to just use your other stroke unaffected limb if there's one available, but that does not promote rehabilitation and progress. And so it's that ongoing support as well as coaching that makes all the difference, but the support is fundamental. And also people do not respond to support that isn't meaningful. So just having your phone beep or repeatedly say things like you're doing great when it doesn't actually know what you're doing and how well you're doing, that does not work, right? So there has to be an agent that actually is there that the user perceives as understanding them. And there's been quite a lot of work now to show that, in fact, this does improve health outcomes. People will exercise longer, and importantly, they'll feel like they're being cared for. So I just want to show a really quick video that always illustrates one other challenge in working with people. So this is a stroke patient. This is a very, very early system from about 12 years ago. Not a really exciting, sexy robot. You'll see much more interesting things later. But this is a key challenge that we encountered early that taught us a lot about doing technologies for people and what drives people. It just beeps when she raises her arm. That's all that's going on. Okay, so it just beeps in response to her arm raise. That's all that's going on. Nothing fancy, 15 years ago. But what does this do to her behavior? So many things. People talk to machines. They perceive them as social companions. And so she is expressing her own personality, and she is just responding to just the beeping, which is accelerating in response to her own rate of progress, nothing the robot is doing. So often it doesn't take that much to be a good social partner. This thing just acknowledges what she's doing. It doesn't even use words. She wants something. What does she want? Just understanding that is incredibly important. Let's see what happens very soon. This is where it gets good. This is where a big lesson begins. All right, so she's getting to a point where she's going to be done with this dull, boring activity of daily life. Now what happens? So she's cheating. And how satisfying. Look at her face. Look how happy she is. She's very motivated to keep cheating. Okay, so this is incredibly important because humans cheat all the time. Why do people cheat? Understanding that is important. So you might say, well, we'll just have a smart system that will detect when someone is cheating and it will tell them when they're cheating. Well, so there are two problems with that. One is, yes, if you can detect that people are cheating, that's great. Telling them that they're cheating is not going to do anything to further motivate them to not cheat. I mean, this is known from human behavior. So right there's a disconnect between what technology could potentially do and what it should do. Second, always detecting that people are cheating is a lost cause. We're not going to be able to do it. So there are much more interesting strategies for engaging people, depending on whether they are cheating or whether the robot even thinks they're cheating or whether maybe it's just guessing. So if you notice, she's most motivated when she's actually cheating. So this is not something to be avoided. It's in fact something that we should take as a lesson about human behavior and say, how can we leverage the fact that some people will want to cheat and will get great joy out of pushing the system to the limit? This has been, of course, found out by a whole bunch of different systems. Subsequently, people say all kinds of interesting things to break things like Alexa and Google Home. And we should not discourage that. These are all interaction experiences. But how do we leverage them? So another domain, Eldercare. Of course, everyone is motivated by Eldercare. I don't have to talk about that, other than to say that there is a popular thing that sometimes the press wants to say, or have historically wanted to talk about, which is that old people don't like technology, quote unquote. And that is, of course, completely incorrect, because in fact, if we look at all the studies that have been done, actual controlled studies, we find that aging individuals do perfectly fine with technology. They actually like it quite a bit. They have their demands and requirements. They just don't like things that are poorly designed for them. So, if you're losing sight and you're forced to interact with a screen that's tiny, well, you don't like it. Neither would I. In fact, I like my tablet, and I don't like tiny phones. But whose problem is that? It is not the user's problem. It is the company's problem, because we must design for the users. They're, after all, the consumers. And so I think there's a disconnect there that gets perpetuated because it might make a good story, but it's in fact not backed up by science. If we look at numerous studies on elderly people using technologies, we find that people are very willing to experiment and try and engage with interesting technologies. There are some beautiful studies that show stress reduction and increased socialization among people as a result of having a robot around. And again, I stress socialization among people with each other, not socialization of just people and the robot. The robot serves as a catalyst to promote socialization. This is something that has been shown with the elderly, and we've shown it with children with autism, and it's just a kind of a pervasive concept of possible uses of this technology in the future. Here's a video of an exercise game that we did a long time ago.
Now let's begin just follow me. And remember, we should take a break at any time. Here we go.
This is useful because even though it's now old tech, one, you still can't buy this. Two, it teaches us still a lot about human behavior and human-machine interaction. First, the robot can't repeat itself, or it looks stupid and inhuman.
Lower your left hand a little bit.
It has to be actually accurate about the interaction. You can't just keep repeating praise or the opposite of praise. It has to be a little surprising.
Exercise gestures. Keep up the good work. Let's continue.
It needs to be encouraging. It needs to be aware of what's going on.
Awesome. Okay, let's try it. Move your arm. Show me what to do.
So in this case, the person shows the robot what to do. Turns out everyone likes this. So in every study that we've done, this is a very large study with 70 participants. People all love this because everybody wants to be in control. They like a robot that makes jokes. People like the robot that's a little vulnerable.
This is my favorite game. It's so much fun.
So these are the kinds of examples of learning of what people actually want, as opposed to kind of pushing technology on them and hoping they'll adapt to it. Sometimes the robot has a failure, like there, where the arm got stuck. I find that users love that. It has to be a non-annoying failure, but a vulnerability is a thing that people want. And so in a final example, here, the user needs to remember.
Now it is the entire gesture sequence. Start with gesture 1 and end with gesture 4.
So if you look at his face, you can predict already that he can't do it. Now, the robot, in this case, does not read faces yet, because this was a while ago, and cannot tell if the person is going to fail or not. But if it could use a different strategy. But it turns out that's still very hard, because even though we have now off-the-shelf, commercial, and open-source software that's based on learning data sets that can recognize emotions in faces, it can mostly recognize emotion in faces that it's trained on through convenient data sets. It doesn't work all that well for the elderly. It doesn't work all that well for kids. And moreover, it doesn't work well at all when people are masking their emotions. And so it's a really interesting time that we live in which we are assuming that technologies will solve these problems. But of course, the data sets are biased, and this is a very big discussion going on, and it should be made even bigger. So do we actually have data sets with actual elderly people being trained, the data sets being trained on elderly data, so that these data sets will provide software that will recognize actual emotions in the elderly, and then in the elderly of the right demographic? And so the data that exists today do not provide any of those abilities. So I'm often asked about, oh, well, can't we recognize facial affect? Well, sort of, in very special circumstances. Don't move your head, don't have a beard, don't look unusual, don't mask your emotions, and so on and so on. And then, yeah, maybe we can a little bit. So it's an interesting time, and things could get better, but only if we're actually getting diverse data and for the right user group, as opposed to assuming that we're training it on Skype users, but it will work for the elderly, because it won't. We've done some interesting work with Alzheimer's, because, again, this is a very complex community. Alzheimer's patients have an interesting novelty effect. Most of the time, we fight the novelty effect. We don't want to think that our technology is working because it's new to people, right? So we want to overcome novelty. But with Alzheimer's, it's unavoidable. The novelty will always be there. It also means that they will not necessarily adapt. So if you show them something that they don't like, they're never going to like it. They're not going to accept it because they're just not going to learn to adapt to it in a way that people might be more tolerant of in a different demographic. Yet, given the rates of Alzheimer's, we have to really understand that population. So I just want to show you a video of a couple of pieces of work that we did quite a while ago, trying to get Alzheimer's patients to actually improve on a task through a robot coach. The task was a cognitive music scaffolded task where the patient would recognize the song with different levels of cues, and the fewer cues, the better. So, some examples. Okay, so a couple of things to point out on this. So first of all, if you notice the mouth of the patient was moving, she was singing along with the robot. The mouth of the robot actually wasn't moving because it was broken, so the motors sometimes don't work. And this, again, is one of the things that's important, because if the robot sets itself up as being perfect, then that's a disappointment to the user. But if the robot sets itself up as vulnerable, then the user actually relates to the robot better. The other thing to notice is the quality of the singing. It's a robot. It could sing with anybody's voice. You can get a licensing deal, and the robot could be Lady Gaga, or it could be Frank Sinatra, it could be anyone. But then the robot squarely steps into the uncanny valley, because the robot isn't Lady Gaga or Frank Sinatra, and even patients with stage 2 Alzheimer's can tell that. And so that, too, is a big lesson in terms of human-machine interaction that people are still starting to discover. There are quite a lot of people developing human-machine interaction technologies who have not actually understood enough about people first, and why the uncanny valley as a concept is, or as a phenomenon, is a very real thing that we need to worry about in research and development. And if you don't know what the uncanny valley is, which is now becoming more and more rare, I recommend looking up an episode of 30 Rock on YouTube that defines it extremely well and in an entertaining way. So both accurate and entertaining. All right, so the next domain is autism. Again, I mentioned the incidence rate is quadrupling. It's a very interesting domain because there's a huge potential to do good for a growing population, and with children in particular, and especially young children. The early we can intervene, the better the behavioral and future outcomes are. And it has been shown that
robot-based interventions for children with autism, so using social assistive robots by many groups across the world, have actually shown therapeutic effects in terms of all of these repeatable therapeutic behavior change. So this is very exciting. There are literally, I just checked, more than 13,000 peer-reviewed papers on robotics for autism, and yet there really aren't almost any products that you can buy to help a kid. So hopefully that will change because that's an example of a tremendous potential. And the point here is that while children should have human therapists, it requires 40 hours a week of therapy, coached therapy, for every child with a certain severity of autism, and no one can afford that, both in terms of just what to do with their lives and in terms of financial support. So the point is that if the technology for human-machine interaction could be there for the child to fill in the care gap that healthcare cannot provide financially and in terms of just hours in life, then that is the synergy that we're looking for. It's enhancing human ability. In this case, it's enhancing the abilities of not just the child, but of the therapist. Oh, here's just some examples. So you see children behaving naturally, which for them is not natural. It's actually atypical because the robot is bringing out social behaviors that are otherwise latent. Here are a couple of examples of imitation. It's very hard for many children on the spectrum, but it happens here both first elicited and then unelicited. So that's elicited, and then here's unelicited imitation. Look at how the boy imitates the pose of the robot without being told to do so. So this is just a video, and it's hard to appreciate if you don't actually have someone in your life with autism. And these days, so many people do have someone in their life with autism, so you can better appreciate some of the challenges here. There have not been enough large-scale studies. So there have been 13,000 peer-reviewed studies with small n. But here's the area where there's tremendous potential, but it is yet to go into the realm of actual clinical validation on any scale that can be appreciated, so it can lead towards real product development. But these are the kinds of examples where AI, machine learning, and robotics have tremendous potential. Another one is diagnosis for autism. We've got some results there. I'll just skip this in the interest of time. Now let me dive specifically in what are the real research challenges in this field, of which there are many. So one is, it's a robot, it has a body. Having a body is complex. But you'll have to have a body, because otherwise it's not embodied. So it's not an app, because the app will not serve to make the person feel motivated and cared for the way that a physical agent will. But now once you have a physical agent, everything matters. How big is it? What is its shape? What is its implied gender? Because there's no way that any human can look at a robot and not perceive a gender, no matter how much you try to make it genderless. So then, what gender is it? Can the user choose the gender, or has the gender been chosen for them intentionally or otherwise? What are the implications? All kinds of issues there. How does the robot move and express itself, even if it's just a robot that sits on the table and maybe can only move its head? Proxemics, the social use of space, you see that in the video above. Pointing, body language, emotion expression, these are all open areas of research in robotics, social robotics, and social assistive robotics, basically in HRI, human-robot interaction. And, we don't yet even know how to make robots gesture naturally, and yet it's so important. So here's an example of the work on just how can we figure out where the robot should stand, how loudly it should speak. So this is an entire dissertation, beautifully done by Ross Mead.
In this work, we consider how the robot recognizes both speech and gestures in a face-to-face social interaction. The robot first imagines itself at thousands of different locations in a room. At each location, it predicts how loudly the person will speak and in what region of space the person will gesture. The robot then predicts how well it will automatically recognize speech and gestures and assigns a score to the location based on this prediction. Finally, the robot selects the location at which it predicts it will perform the best and moves to that location. Here, we see the robot predicts it will work well between 1.5 and 2.5 meters. The robot selects 1.7 meters as the optimal location to recognize human speech and gestures and moves there.
So that's incredibly boring, even though very good science. What really matters is how do you now apply that in a real-world context where a person moves wherever they choose to move in real time. And when done right, It looks like dancing. But only if you have the right music. So who says disco's dead? Look at the young graduate student appreciating disco in real time. Look at that smile. Everyone's happy. So when proxemics is done correctly, when the use of space is done correctly, it can be so elegant it can be dancing. But when it's done wrong, and it's done incorrectly or maliciously,
You are about to kill me.
it's bullying.
If you don't kill people, it will typically hurt them. Stopping, pointing, and laughing at people is not appropriate. You should not do this because it is demeaning. Stop. You look like you are about to punch me. Punching is violent.
So we go on and on. This is about my point earlier about data. So bullying is a pervasive concept that is alive and well and thriving in our schools. And so how can we teach kids not to bully? It turns out robots are actually quite good at influencing behavior in that way. The robot can actually be listened to by a child because it's more interesting than listening to your peer, which, you know, if someone tends to be a bully, they might not actually listen to why they shouldn't be. So there's great potential there to actually create more positive human interactions. But how would the robot even recognize bullying? After all, how do you train on bullying data when bullying is supposed to be covert? Yes, we can get actors that will pretend to be bullying, but that will not be nearly as effective. So there's these sort of interesting questions of how do you collect realistic data? And we actually set it up to where we had kids truly, honestly, genuinely bullying our robot because we had an open house. And as soon as the kids found out that the robot was, quote, sensitive, as you heard, they were more than happy to bully it without any prompting. Which just brings me to the point that collecting really good, valid, truly representative data is hard. And it's still not being done on a large scale. So the next challenge after embodiment is social interaction. It's in many ways the ultimate challenge. We're humans. We're surrounded by people. We're not all that great at getting along at many levels, whether it's one-on-one or, you know, international. So interacting with people is complex, and the level of complexity goes all the way down to turn-taking, timing, social perceptions, theory of mind, recognizing intent, recognizing affect, and then social roles. Are we equal? Who is in charge? Is that difference going to persist? Does it change situationally? And so on. All these things are incredibly important as we develop technologies for people, because really what makes us social is what made us intelligent, and it's what keeps us going. But if we lose that, as we are losing it in some ways, in the U.S., 12-year-olds now have measurably good social skills of 8-year-olds. If we lose that, then then you get societal outcomes that might not be desirable. So can we actually develop machines that help us be better socially rather than worse? And it turns out we can. This is just an example of a spatial language system that helps the elderly, but I will skip it in the interest in time and actually tell you about more recent work where we used a robot to help groups of people solve problems together. And instead of eliciting these competitive dynamics that groups often have, we managed to demonstrate that the robot, just by being there and trying to equalize the dynamics, made the group get along better, made everybody be sort of a report being happier, and most importantly, made individuals less selfish. So this is a very interesting thing. We already know from the science of organizations that, you know, when you get groups of people to work together, you get personalities asserting themselves, you get certain people who talk too much, others don't get a word in, isn't necessarily most conducive to solving problems effectively and getting a diverse point of view heard. And so it was very interesting to find that we could introduce a robot into a scenario of human problem solving, and the robot didn't even understand what people were saying. It could just tell who was talking. It could keep track of how long they were talking and use only those data to, in fact, influence things like, oh, you know, well, Mary, you haven't said much. What do you think? Oh, Bill, that's great, but let's hear from some others. And when you have a robot doing that kind of moderation, it is more tolerated than a human doing the same. After all, people hire moderators all the time, but it's kind of questionable as to how well accepted they are. And then interestingly, people overall became less selfish. They were more willing to help each other, to cede their turns, and even in competitive games, they actually would not try for the optimal winning strategy every time. So they became more empathetic. And interestingly, the effect was conserved even beyond the time that the robot was there. So you could remove the robot, have the group meet later, and their good behavior would be sustained. So this is an interesting example, not just of how we can do, how we can address, for example, modeling moderation as a resource allocation problem from a computing perspective, but I think more interestingly, how we can actually say machines do not have to dehumanize. In fact, they can be the most human thing in the room. They can make people less selfish. Those are the kinds of enhancement, augmentation technologies that we should all think about developing. And then finally, the ultimate problem, of course, is staying together. Machine learning is hard, but what's really harder is people staying together. So sustained engagement is hard, personalization is challenging, getting balanced, diverse data is challenging. People are terrible at sustained relationships. Why do we think robots can do better? Well, hopefully they can. We should be making our better selves. So this is a very interesting problem. And robots, of course, must learn in order to, in fact, be effective around people, because otherwise they become boring and ineffective in the best case and completely broken in the worst case. I just want to tell a story about a robot that we developed. We initially were challenged by collaborators at Children's Hospital Los Angeles to reduce pain in kids receiving IVs, because they had read a paper that showed that you can give a robot to kids who are getting flu shots and they would be distracted and not feel the pain as much. So it turns out distraction is not a really great way to reduce pain, because when you have to get an IV, it's not the same as a flu shot. It takes a lot longer, there's a lot more anxiety, there's a lot more anticipation. So really the child has to learn to cope, and the robot has to help the child learn to cope. And the robot has to learn what coping strategy works best for each child, because some kids just really, really need to regulate their physiologic regulation, so they have to kind of calm down and breathe calmly and not look at the needle. I would be in that category. And then there are others who really want to understand exactly what's going to happen, because it's the fear of unknown that's really making them scared, not the actual pain. It's the unknown and how to address that. And they really want to know. They want to see. They want to be talked through it. So learning what the right strategy is, and then giving that strategy to the child so that the child can learn to cope rather than just be distracted by watching videos, which is, again, ineffective in a long, painful procedure. This is an interesting direction, again, that emerges by collecting the data from a real scenario and then understanding what is the niche that the robot can play rather than a priori deciding that we think we know what the robot can do. It turns out this kind of empathetic robot has a very good outcome. We're now up to about 20 patients that have been enrolled in controlled conditions, with the robot just sitting there as a baseline, with the robot actually helping them cope, and then with no robot at all, and they're very strong results. We've also worked with young kids and teaching kids things that are otherwise boring. Here's an example.
Yeah, fantastic. I wanted to do that. Why do you think this is such a healthy cereal?
Because it's healthy for me and it makes me strong.
Yes, and it's healthy because it has fiber in it. Do you know what fiber is good for?
Well, I'll just stop there and you all can wonder whether you know what fiber is good for. So, in closing, just a couple of last videos. So we have this challenge for machine learning, for AI, for human-machine interaction, whether it's HCI, HRI, of taking multimodal data that is diverse and representative, and then having algorithms that are actually able to, in a believable, lifelike way, adapt to each user. I want to show you an example of what it looks like and when it works extremely well. This is a very young child who is going to be interacting with the robot in real time. Look at the turn taking. Look at the eye gaze.
1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 1, 4.
First of all, this is actually very important because children need to get the social interaction and the tangible learning experience in order to learn. But they don't necessarily get the opportunity to get that interaction. And so it is possible for technologies to provide that, but then they have to do all of the hard stuff of where is the child looking, how well are they performing on the task, what is their emotional state. There's so much to be taken into account beyond just are they getting the answer right or not. And that's true for school as much as it is for technology. And so there is a tremendous opportunity to do this well, but right now we don't see machine learning algorithms actually taking multimodal data. There's a whole lot of work with sort of unimodal oh, well, you know, we can do a whole lot with one modality, but what is really only beginning to be thought about, much less done, is, you know, give me machine learning that can work with eye gaze, body pose, facial affect, and performance on the task, because that is the beginning of where we need to be going. So, in summary, the dovetailed goals of our research and socially assistive robotics in general are to, on the one hand, develop machines that can enhance and not replace human ability, and then at the same time, to drive scientific inquiry. When you actually provide people with an interaction that is enriching with a machine, you can not only improve their lives, but you can actually learn more about them. So we can learn more about things like autism, things like Alzheimer's, through these interactions. And the reason the machines need to provide them is, one, because it's very hard sometimes to get someone to be with a person with advanced Alzheimer's for 20 hours a day. And secondly, that we cannot control precisely those interactions. People get tired, they get burnt out, and unfortunately, people get neglectful and abusive. But robots don't need to, and they shouldn't. And so there's this opportunity to help bridge the gaps in human care until there are no gaps. And whether there will be gaps in the future, whether people will in the future just take care of people, if so, if trained people who are properly trained and compensated can do the care for all the people who need it, then we won't need machines. But until then, we do. So, and in those contexts, machines can do good.
With these robots, I get everything's cool with these robots. Yes.
Do you think something was going to be wrong with the robot?
Nothing wrong with those robots.
This is an example of a boy with autism. We didn't understand why he was so adamant about it until a therapist explained to us that for a child with autism, they're being told constantly what is wrong with them. And the fact that there's nothing wrong with the robot and he can play with the robot and the robot likes him, that is very exciting and sadly all too rare. Oops. Couple more videos. That's it.
How nice to have someone, a robot, to tell you you're using your right hand. It's great. Instead of telling you, please use your right hand, like my husband does.
No offense to the husband, but taking care of people is very, very hard. And most caregivers will tell you that they could use some help. And that's why, if I can run my videos.
The sooner that you can do this, the better.
So that's why, hopefully, more people can get excited to go into augmentation and enhancement of human ability rather than just automation and replacement. Thank you, and I'll be glad to take questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Maja. That was a very, very interesting topic. Actually, we have a lot of questions, so I don't believe we'll be able to go through all of those, but I'll start going through some, and maybe you can touch upon that. So one question that we have here is, in the video, the robot has been anthropomorphized, well, one half, so kind of it looks like a human. So the question is, do robots have to necessarily look like us, or can they look like something like R2D2, like robots?
So that's a great question, and actually, it is not the case that all of the robots we use are anthropomorphized. Most of our most recent work has actually been done with squash and stretch kind of robots just on the tabletop. So the quick answer, because I want to get to as many questions as possible, the short answer is no, the anthropomorphism isn't important because users will ascribe all manner of human-like features to the robot. They will ascribe intentionality, emotion, personality, and so on to any intelligent agent. What is important is that the robot's physicality has to have the affordances to express itself. So the robot does need to be able to express emotion somehow, and that's, in fact, not impossible to do even with a Roomba vacuum cleaner, but it's harder. And then if it needs to do things like help with rehabilitation, like our robot did, then it did need to do things like it needed to have arms so they could point and exercise. So no, it's not important that it be anthropomorphic, but it is important that it be sufficiently expressive so that people can perceive agency and that it can do the task it needs to do.
Great. Another question, how does usage of virtual or possibly augmented reality compare to the real-world hardware of the robot?
Well, people haven't done any detailed studies to compare AR and VR with robotics. There have been many studies that compare screen-based agents, whether on a full screen or a smaller screen, with physical robots, and there the data are conclusively, and many studies strongly backing up physical embodiment. So people much prefer and change their behavior more when they interact with a physical robot than with a screen. Now, virtual reality definitely has plenty of evidence to show that if you immerse someone, especially in a cave-like environment, you can trick the brain to believe that it is in a real setting. So I believe that is going to be as effective as working with real robots. The problem is that if, for example, I'm trying to teach a child social interaction, immersing that child into a totally separate world is not really helpful towards that goal. The whole point is to bring people together, not to separate them further through another layer of another world, which is the virtual world. So I think VR and AR have tremendous potential in certain domains, but they can't address all issues because people still need to interact with people in this world.
Great. Another question is, how do stroke victims feel about working with a robot? Is there any age differential in the willingness of people to work with the robot?
So we have done studies, and they're published journal publications on this, definitely not just by us, but by quite a few different people. And basically, just as a meta-level summary, I would say that stroke rehab is a lonely and demoralizing exercise because for the rest of your life, you need to be getting better and doing things very consciously. And so people have been very receptive to interacting with robots, especially interesting, fun, socially assistive ones. There doesn't seem to be an age difference. What we find across all of our domains is not that there's a difference in terms of age or even things like autism versus stroke versus Alzheimer's, because people are people. What we do find is that, for example, children are more demanding because they're not so task-driven. So, kind of keeping them engaged is a different challenge than keeping an adult engaged. But an adult might for example, might agree more with things that the robot requires compared to a child. But then they also will want it to be more precise. So there's slight differences, but fundamentally what engages people and what motivates them is that social component. So that doesn't vary across ages. What is the appropriate social content across different ages? Of course, that varies. So what's fun to a grandma is not the same thing that's fun for a 5-year-old.
Okay. We probably have time for one more question. The attendee asks, these robots have the opportunity to collect the behavioral parts of person which are being assisted, such as emotions, wake-up times, behavioral answers, and so forth. Question is, what is the impact of privacy of data?
So privacy, great question. I will answer that, but before we end, let me just say one thing. So I have this policy about answering all questions for my talk. So if people have burning questions, you guys can either collect them and send them to me. People can email me. I'll endeavor to answer them. I also on my website have a lot of answers from some of the interviews. I think it's really important to disseminate information about emerging fields. So just because we have to stop soon doesn't mean that I'm not willing to answer questions. Okay, privacy. So the privacy issue is a really important and sensitive one. I'm a firm believer that people should know what data they're giving away. And I think that's extremely obscured today, with everything, all the devices that we have listening and hearing us. And the best services require data to go in the cloud. So now you kind of have to, in order to get the service, you give up privacy. And that's, that ship has kind of sailed already. So I think, you can say, well, I don't want it, but it's sort of happening already. The bigger issue is sort of security, I would say, which is, who can get at those data. So it's not so much that maybe I don't trust Amazon to know what I'm buying because they already know what I'm buying. It's sort of who else can get those data. And that's a mild example. So we and others have not found that patients, the elderly, are not willing to give up the data. They are willing to give up the data in order to get the service because they're desperate to get better. Parents are desperate to help their children. And the people who are taking the data typically are not trying to do things like sell it on the side, because there is a legally binding contract that the data will not be used inappropriately. Because, you know what the contract is. You can only agree to it. For example, I will only give my child's data to someone if they're not going to share with anyone else. But the bigger issue is security. So I think people need to really think about, when they think about privacy, there's privacy and then there's security. And we're not, in general, currently in the world, great at security. So right now, the most data security issues are around things that can be monetized, right? So people are not really stealing videos of children with autism because that's not really monetizable, thank goodness. But they are stealing things like social security numbers, etc. But in general, security to me is the really large issue that overlaps with privacy. And I think not just to me, of course, that's the point, is that that's what people worry about, and that is worth worrying about. There's the other issue, which is that your agent will know things like, oh, you're going for a walk, so maybe it'll say things like, hey, you want to buy some new Nike shoes to go for that walk? Because there will be plenty of product placement that will come with these technologies as well. I'll stop there and everyone can contemplate.
No, yeah, this is great. Thank you. We're running out of time, so I will just want to thank you again for suggesting that you can answer some of the questions. We'll collect them. There are a few people that are indicating interest to help or collaborate, or questions about where they can find robots. So it will probably be best for us to capture and share that information. So having said that, back to Rose.
Yeah, thank you. So we will try to collect those questions, and we'll get them to you, Maja, and then get them out to everybody with a link. And I'd like to thank Maja again for her informative presentation and the answers to these questions. We certainly have a lot of questions more to ask, so we could have gone a little bit longer, but thanks, and a special thanks to each one of you for taking the time to participate today. You can find other announcements on upcoming webinars and learning activities at thelearning.acm.org. Showing on the screen too is a quick survey where you could suggest future topics or speakers, or just your feedback from today's presentation. So please take that. It only takes like about 5 minutes. And then again, on behalf of ACM, SIG-AI, Maja, Plowman, and myself, thanks for joining us today. Please also take a few minutes to look at the SIG-AI web pages and join our group. Thanks for attending, and see you next time. This concludes our webinar.
Thank you.